Yeah, absolutely. And I was raised, I mean, being raised by Nigerian, like in a Nigerian context, although it was in London, it's a collective culture. So extended family is real. And there were always aunties, which was great when it was your birthday, but terrible when you got in trouble for something because you'd have to talk to every single auntie, and it was an absolute nightmare. But I was
That's
used to the whole collective vibe, and how meaningful that could be. And I think that was an integral part of my understanding that that's how families existed.
Hmm.
And so therefore there would be people you weren't outsourcing, but it was more that the nuclear family was never the original design.
Welcome to the Eden Podcast, where we true the verse of Genesis 3:16, and we discover that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way.
I was speaking at missional movement type events and things like that. And what would happen is I'd get to the restroom and there would always be a group of women who I end up talking with, either while waiting in line, but they would be asking questions like, how did you start speaking? And how did you know if it was right? And like really meaningful kind of coaching, consultative type questions. And from the stall, or someone really apologizing for taking up your time, but it's the only time they've seen a woman speaker. It's the only time, again, the can't be what you can't see type vibe. And asking questions about it. And I remember coming away feeling really really glad for the conversation, but really irritated on their behalf. Because again, when I'm in these other environments where I was often the only woman, definitely the only Black woman in the room, I'm seeing what my male peers are getting. I'm seeing them see themselves. I'm seeing them be discipled, be mentored, have these side conversations, being given opportunities, doors opening on their behalf. I'm seeing all of that and thinking these women who are in the restroom aren't getting access to any of this.
Wow.
And I remember thinking, basically, a woman's calling is worth more than 5 minutes in the loo. And her investment in herself and her investment in processing these meaningful, diligent, faithful questions so that they could be faithful with what God had called them to is worth more than thinking, am I a stalker, stalking the speaker to see if I can ask her a question?
Yeah.
And so that was one of the things about it. And I remember talking to the guys I worked with, and they're like, "Yeah, this is really important, but wouldn't it be great if men and women could work together?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about right now," because I knew that there were questions that I knew even, and I'm pretty confident that there are things that I edited in their presence. There were things I didn't say because I'm like, I don't have time today for this. I don't have time for the ways I'm going to have to explain myself so you understand. I'm not saying this because I'm angry. I'm just saying this because it needs to be asked. Do you know what I mean? All of these things.
Yeah.
And so I began to think about it more and more. And when I was traveling and speaking, I'd sometimes bring women with me and they'd be like, can we go? And then you'd have these events and then I'd be in the restaurant for hours processing stuff with the women I was with. And so I began to ask the question, what would it be like to connect a group of women together who were leaders? And I knew a couple of things. I knew that if you got them in the room, they would take care of it. Do you know what I mean? That it wasn't going to be just about the main speakers, that it would include that, but you just need to create the space and they would interact with one another. And again, a bit like the immigrant family I grew up in, that they would be a brain trust for one another. I knew that. I'd seen it since I was a kid, so I knew that would be the case. I knew that they needed to be a place where they could retreat to advance. Not that, I mean, again, most of my life I've worked alongside men. I just knew there needed to be a space where they could say the things that they kind of systematically edited for years.
Sure.
And that was, sorry, go on.
No, and I remember, I don't remember if it was you or Stephanie who were leading the EZER Collective 6 months ago that I was at, but I remember one of you saying toward the beginning, like, okay, now you're here, you've made all the arrangements to get here, you've, lined up things for your kids, your husband, like all the things, but now this is your time. And like just inviting us to switch our mindsets to like a receiving mode of like, receive, relax, rest in this space. We're going to have time, your heart, your head are going to get to, receive and process. And I remember appreciating that permission to be like, okay, you've done all the work to get here. Now, like, don't miss out on what you can have by being, elsewhere in your mind. But now that you're here, like it was, yeah.
And I think on top of that, part of our heart and desire when building this was, and to do all of that from the perspective of you not having to argue about whether you're a leader. You already are. You're a leader. And as such, rather than as your calling isn't a concession that has to be squeezed into the framework of your day. That happens enough. I get that. But in this space, we get to talk to you and look at you as a leader who has a contribution to make, but things to receive that will empower your leadership, because you spend so much time investing in everybody else's life and their ministries and their departments, making it work, that you have under-resourced yourself. And then you wonder why you're not as eligible for the promotions, or you're not feeling as confident in the meetings, or you're not all of these things, and you haven't leveraged your networks because you've made friends, but you haven't leveraged them for your advantage because it feels arrogant to do so. And so we wanted to say this is a dedicated space for you, the leader that you are. And there'll be women like you and not like you, all with a goal for you to build up your leadership so that you could go back and do what you're called to do. And then EZER, because of Genesis 2:18, where it talks about being where God talks about making a suitable helper. And when I was at college, I did biblical studies, and I did Greek and Hebrew for 3 years, partly because of some of this stuff, partly because I'm like, I know, again, I'm an immigrant. I know things are lost in translation. I just, things, there are nuance, there's cultural context, there are mores that you just can't find words for. So I'm like, I want to find out what's lost in translation, because certain things don't add up for me, because there are clearly women all over the Bible doing stuff. So I just need do you know what I mean? I think some of it was, I just want to get my head around a few things. And so it was out of that I learned more. I just learned more about the languages themselves and how they function and how they operate and the expansiveness of them. But then also seeing that EZER was way more than the backup plan it had been reduced to being. And the kind of Girl Friday kind of weird vibe that it was reduced to being, and to see this word of strength and rescue and saving and power and all of that, and just thought, well, that's a bit different. Do you know what I mean? And words are so powerful to know that God's first definition, like explicit definition of her after image bearer is this. Well, that changes everything. That changes everything. And so I wanted to name it something which reflected the women in the room, that collectively these God-fueled women and I'm sure this is true of you guys. It's not that I don't believe in equality for women. Of course I do. But this is theological as much as anything else. It's not just that it's 2024 or 2025 or whatever year it is. It's not about keeping up with the current times. In fact, I'd like to be old school about this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to our foundations and reset.
Yeah.
That's what it came about for me, and then contextualize it in our world. But I don't feel like I'm trying to be culturally relevant. I didn't feel that we were trying to keep up with the times. I felt we were trying to get back to the roots of what God had intended, and that we actually do see work its way out through Scripture. And so part of the dream for EZER Collective then was to have these intensives that wouldn't hold on to women too tightly, but would invest in them and go, and invest in them and go, and invest in them and go. And so they can get back and do what God had always called them to do. Yeah.
I love that so much. When I was at a previous church with my husband. Our girls were like twin. Our girls have always been twins. Our twins were babies. And I was invited to do some writing for the blog for the women's ministry at my church. And I wanted to write about finding like how I was relating to God in a new way as a brand new mom. Like the EZER thing I'd known my whole life, like, a woman, a helper, but the word helper, EZER, is often used for God. So like I'd understood that, but I was finding new layers of like, okay, but as I mother my children, as I breastfeed my babies, as I develop this bonding, as I hold them when they cry, like this is so intimate. And there are passages in the Bible that talk about God like a mother hen, or like an eagle, with its eaglets under her wing. I'm beginning to be like, whoa, this is meaning even more to me now that I'm physically mothering my own babies. And so I wrote a blog on like God mothering me.
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying to say God is a woman, but I was
Yeah.
saying if we are made in God's image, male and female, he made them in his image, male and female. I was like, what does it mean to be a female in God's image? In what ways am I like
Yeah.
God as I am mothering my baby that he must be doing for me? And I got asked to not, no, they chose not to use that article.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, but it got me all fired up. And so it was like
Yeah.
episode number 5 was that was the episode of the Mom Podcast, was all that content, because I was like, this needs to get out, right? But I think so tell me, I love talking with the woman who I know understands a lot of shares these same values of understanding EZER and who we are, and being in God's image, female. You talked about the EZER Collective, a time when you lost your voice. I physically lost my voice also when I was 18, played the lead role in the musical at my high school, vocal damage. And I had to go for a whole month of no talking.
Yeah.
That kind of vocal rest changed me forever. Like you show up in a group of people and you can't, people whisper because you can't talk, you're like, what?
That's not what's happening.
You're like, I can still hear you, you're like, I'm still fully here too, in every other way, but, I resonated so much when you talked about giving a woman, helping women own their voice. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, the context for me of 2 things. One was in the years of doing work with women, focusing on women, that has been the single most thing I've heard.
Really?
From women around the world. I've lost my voice. I need to find my voice. Where's my voice gone? I feel my voice was taken. That has been the most prevalent
Really?
statement I've heard. And that they're not just talking about physical. Do you know what I mean? If there's
right.
a visceral level, there's something of who they are and their identity, their understanding of their God-given identity and how they show up in the world is off.
Yeah.
That's what they know. And so I think that was part of the stirring. And again, when I lost my voice, I had to go to the doctor, and she said, when you lose your voice, it's not lost, it's damaged, as you described. You had vocal damage.
Yeah.
And she said it's damaged by trauma and your environment and habits. She was just reeling off this list of examples, and I thought that is such a powerful picture of what happens to women, what happens to leaders, what happens to women leaders. It's not
slow down and like tell us those things. What were those things? Yeah.
So she said, in terms of the picture, it's not lost, it's damaged, it's trauma. And I thought, well, I mean, where do we begin on the trauma and the continuum of trauma, from things like the sexual assaults and the sexual harassment that every time I gather women, there are women who have encountered that inside the church and outside the church, and what that's their voice, some from childhood. And the ones who have had the spiritual abuse, how it's felt disloyal to use their voice, how it's felt unfeminine, ungodly to speak out about how a spouse, a boyfriend, because for some it's even while they're dating, a spouse or a boyfriend or a pastor, a leader in the church has treated them, because aren't they supposed to be, and aren't I supposed to be? And so their voice damaged by that, left an imprint. Damaged by the environment that they're in, where they are tolerated rather than celebrated, where they are tokenized rather than treated with respect, and that's made itself known with the jokes that aren't funny, the questions about whether they're on their period and whether that's why they're saying what they're doing, the environment which doesn't accept the fact that when women have children, it affects their bodies and their time and their energy, and therefore they're not as available. And I don't know, maternity leave, parental leave would be good here. Environment which actually defaults to whether it's conscious, unconscious, or explicit bias in terms of what a woman can bring, whether she's always going to be the one who takes notes in a meeting, whether she's always going to be the one who doesn't need the equal pay because this guy's, he's providing for his family, as though she isn't. You know what I mean? The environments which shrink her and say, to get ahead, you've got to do this. Like I remember talking out loud once at an event saying, it was probably as the advent of Me Too in the public space, we know like in the background, Tarana Burke had been doing work for years, but when it became more publicly known, I remember saying out loud, why did we call the casting couch instead of rape? You know, why didn't we call it sexual assault? You know, why was the language that, it's amazing, the language that it was hidden in plain sight, the language of sleeping her way to the top, or was she abused and then silenced with an opportunity? And so environment will steal your voice, and a hostile environment, an environment which overlooks you, an environment which seduces you, an environment that controls you, all of those things will impact how you show up in the world, and and the contribution you make. Because what energy have you got left to offer anything after all of that? When you're fighting to validate that you have an opinion, don't expect to have any dreams and visions. Not because they don't exist, not because she doesn't have any, but purely because it's taking everything to show up. It's taken all your gifts and abilities to show up and say you have a right to exist. I remember saying this to somebody once, saying, you know, I shouldn't have to keep on being in meetings telling you I'm here.
Yeah.
I shouldn't have to keep on you don't have to come here and say men matter. What about a male perspective? You don't have to come here and say a white man matters. Why do I have to come here and represent all Black women or represent all women and say a woman's perspective matters? Why do I have to fight for my gender? Or you to see me through, to see and to contextualize my life? What, you know, and when you're spending all your time doing that, or a lot of your time and energy doing that, that becomes your calling somehow. Or it becomes almost like this warped version of calling.
Yeah. So if we had someone listening right now who's saying, yeah, I feel that way. I've spent so much of my life having to like defend my existence and justify my place in the room or my spot at the table. You know, and you've given talks on, you know, finding your voice. Is there one thing you would say about, you know, where do you begin with finding your voice?
I think you have to return to first principles, and sometime, and so in terms of I'd say two things to that person. I'd say, first of all, audit how long, whether it's worth staying there, because it does have diminishing returns. It's not neutral. I'd love to say it's neutral, but it has diminished. That's why people like the vocal damage. The reason why you had to come completely onto zero and to zero talking for that month of vocal rest is because speaking wasn't neutral. It would only amplify the damage. It would only compound.
That's such a good point.
So you had to stop.
Because of the damage that was already created, the healing process required a complete rest.
And so I would ask people to audit, to have an honest audit in terms of diminishing returns here. Are we at the point where a few exercises in that environment are fine? Or are you at the point where actually you go further and you don't get up the same? I think we have to ask ourselves. I think in terms of the finding of your voice, well, since it is damaged, then you do actually have to work out how to heal. Because I think that's one of the lies that comes to us. When it's finding, then the onus is on you. And there's you've got to go searching around and proving and all of that kind of stuff. When actually, if it's damage, you treat it completely differently.
That's so good.
And so I want to go back to, I often ask the question of leaders particularly, and women particularly, who were you before anybody told you who you were supposed to be? And I think that's the first question I'd ask. Who were you before anyone said who you were supposed to be? Like what you articulated for me, saying, you know, at 9, it was very clear that you were a leader. And yet for me, and there were moments like that when I was 5, when I was 9, and then it got buried. Puberty will do it all by itself. Do you know what I mean? Never mind anybody else. And then a little, you know, a little adolescence here, a little heartbreak there, a little this there, a little overlooking here, there, and the other, and it just gets buried and it's buried and it's buried, and it becomes easier and simpler to not even try. And so my voice got buried under the rubble of all of these other things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's life, you know, like, I don't know, a global pandemic will do it for you, through to having to, you know, a crisis in the family, or lack of resources in your family, but sometimes it's relationships. Maybe that person is insecure and they only seem to love you when you're quieter and smaller and stuff. And so you've made a truce. You've called it peace, but actually you've made a truce of some kind. And again, because it's not how God designed you, it actually isn't working for you at all, because you're living, and now it's all burning up inside, you know. I think that some of it is who did God wire you as? And so when we don't know, because sometimes people are like, oh, I used to do this, or I used to know this, or I used to sing, or I used to be like this as a person, and until that point, or until life got tiring, I didn't know, or my season of life changed, I'm just exhausted. And so sometimes we can trace our way back, and I'd say, what did you used to love, and what did you used to do? And when you look back on your years, are there some repeated patterns about where you felt alive, or where you contribution? But I do come back to this. I do come back to the first few chapters of Genesis, because so does everybody else, really. Aren't I supposed to be the helper? Isn't the guy supposed to come first? Weren't we more easily deceived? Those are the things I hear again. And so it's like, well, if we're going to, so we do actually need to do that work, and that understanding of saying, when God made you, what was he actually thinking about you?
Yeah.
When Jesus redeemed humanity, what did that mean for and started saying, I'm making all things new? What did that mean for you? What does he say about your design? What does it mean to be made in his image as an image bearer? What does it mean that he's also called EZER throughout scripture? And so you are his child, and what does it mean for you to carry the family resemblance? What does it mean for you to represent him in the world? Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
But because those ones aren't grounded, because otherwise people start saying, well, you know, I found my voice today, but is it really what God would want me to do? I know, like, you know, I know culturally it's okay, but is God okay with it? And because, again, also buried under the rubble of these damaged voices are many of the stories of the women in the Bible. You get Christmas, and you get someone on Mother's Day for reasons I have yet to understand, and then you don't hear about anybody else. And so that thing, again, like we began with, about it's hard to be what you can't see. If you don't see Shira building 3 towns, if you don't see Huldah advising kings, if you don't see Lydia the businesswoman, if you don't see Deborah the judge, if you don't see Phoebe as a deacon, you don't see all of these, you don't see Junia because they changed the name. If you don't see all of these people who are different ethnicities, different life stages, different marital status, different economic groups, then where do you see yourself?
Yeah. I mean, preach. I mean, this is such a great plug to go back and listen to the first 4 seasons of the Eden podcast. It's all laying it out of like, it's so important. It's so important. And it may, and I would say to people, if you do need to go back, don't feel bad about going back and listening again. Yeah.
You know, we've had decades of hearing nothing. Do you remember that? Do you remember that film, Hidden Figures?
Yeah.
That film, Hidden Figures, about the African-American women who were the computers behind the
like the space with NASA, right? Weren't they NASA scientists, but they never were known publicly.
They were never known. And I remember watching an interview with Taraji P. Henson, and they said, how did you feel when you read the script and you heard the story? And she said, I felt angry. She said, I felt really angry. She goes, I was never going to be a mathematician. But she said, this was our history. We never heard this is who we were, what we did. We have all these other things about Black women, but we didn't hear this about us. We didn't hear who these women were. And she said, she grieved the loss of the story, that she could have grown up seeing women like this. And then she said, I shouldn't have had to wait until my late 30s, 40s to find out these women existed.
Yeah.
And because it changes the picture of what is possible when these again, I would say to those who are like, oh my gosh, I'm like, go back to this early seasons and listen again, because this is your spiritual heritage, and they need and the realities of the first chapters of Genesis needs to be hidden no more. Yeah, because it's definitive in terms of what it means for how we function, how we live our lives, how we do relationships, how we lead, how we love people, how we raise our children, how we treat people. It's definitive.
And where else are people getting the story? Where else are people hearing this? I mean, I didn't grow up hearing it in church. I don't know what other context I have. I can go listen to these episodes.
Yeah.
And that might be it. Yeah. Yeah. That might be a really great place to wrap it up. I'm like, where are we? What? Let me move. I can't even see how much time we've been talking. I don't even know like how long we've been going. I love this. It's great. Lost in the conversation.
Just thing together.
Yeah, it's so fun. It's so fun. You and I have both been wedding singers. We both married men younger than us. I was born in Zaire. It's now the Congo.
Oh, cool.
Lived there and in Central African Republic till I was 6. So I have that experience of culturally, when we came to the States, I looked like most of my classmates most of them were white, but I didn't feel white and I didn't feel American, but nobody else kind of, people wouldn't understand that either. Cause just from appearance, they didn't know that I felt like I was completely different. So I'm thinking through like all these things and just wondering, is there any like last thing I want to like ask you to share about or connect with? Just because there's so much good stuff to touch here, but why don't we there were 2 things I thought of asking, like, are there any tools that you use with women in like a coaching or consultative context to like help them understand themselves and know themselves? I know, like, I grew up with a great foundation, parents who are scholars, theologians, grandparents, Bible teachers, so really great foundation in the word, but I think for me, I wish I'd had a little bit more understanding of like, how am I wired uniquely as me? Now there's things out there, Strengths Finder and, Myers-Briggs assessments and, all this stuff. But like, are there things that you use to help people just identify like what makes me come alive? What am I naturally good at? Like, how can understanding myself lead to being myself and being who God has called me to be?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I do find some of those assessments can be helpful, like Myers-Briggs or Enneagram or Strengths Finders. And I'd say pick the one you like and don't get boxed by the ones you don't. But one of the things I love to do when I'm talking to at the very beginning is literally a timeline, one sheet of paper and their life, and just say, okay, look at the highlights, the hardships, and the heroes of the story. And to see what they reveal, because some of it I find we need to excavate, and then I get people to look back and say, when were you like think of times when you've led and what were you doing, how did it feel? And so what we're trying to do when we're doing that work is getting them to uncover who God had already in some ways take off the rubble for them. Because I think that was part of my story. I think I was, although I was leading, it took a long time to realize I was. And then I look back and it's like, oh gosh, you really didn't have a clue. And in terms of, I was always the captain of sports teams. I was always the one at school who was doing some leadership role in the classroom. Do you know what I mean? In the youth group, I was always leading, always.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel like one, so I didn't think I was one. I didn't feel confident, so I didn't feel I was one. It didn't feel enough to be one. But all the evidence was there. So I often get people to go back and look at the evidence of their lives, and to see what's always been there. And if they're uncertain, to talk to a friend who they trust and say, what do you see? Because sometimes our people they see us differently, without the judgment that we put on ourselves. To say, well, what do you think about this? Because I think that tells you the story of you.
Yeah.
And that can affirm, because sometimes when you hear I'm an Enneagram this, or I'm a Strengths Finder this, it's like, well, I'm told I am, but is it me? I don't know if I did it. I'm not sure. And so I like those, but I kind of almost want them after the other stuff of excavating your own story.
Yeah. So would you encourage people to go find someone who knows them well, and ask them some questions? What do you see in my story? Yeah. Because sometimes we have our own lenses on and our own biases.
Yeah, and I think we can be just real taskmasters on ourselves. And a friend of mine did the foreword for one of my books once. She told the story of the Himba tribe, I think it was, who have a song they sing over a child when the child is born, and that song comes out again if that child as an adult has lost their way, and they sing they surround the then adult and sing over them to remind them. And I just thought, again, it's another one of these powerful pictures of your people know your story, And sometimes you just need someone to sing it over you again. And there have been moments like, I mean, I'm sure I can say this to you, when you had your twins and you're like, okay, now, well, there's laundry and there's sleeplessness and I don't know what else. I'm like, no, there is no manual for this. Who are you now? And it's not that you don't want it, and it's not that you regret it, and it's not about that. It's just, how do you take where you were into this chapter, and how do you take where you are into the next chapter? And so in those moments, sometimes you need the people who know you well and who know the you that you've been, to say, yeah, you still make sense. It's different for sure, but you've always had these gifts and you've always had these talents, and these were the things I remember about you, and you used to love doing that, so why aren't you doing that again, because that used to bring you life. And they can help you on the journey. And again, this probably comes back to me with the collective thing. I don't think that's a weakness. I think that's the function of community. I think it's the function of community. To, like, identity comes in the context of community anyway. So I think that's the function of a healthy community, to be able to speak into each other's lives like that, and to remind each other, because life is a lot. And I don't think we need to feel, again, that issue of finding your voice sometimes makes it an individualistic pursuit and makes it a blame pursuit, like you lost something because you were careless or frivolous. When actually, this is, we do change. I'm not who I was when I was 9, or when I was 20, or when I was 30 or 40, but there are threads. And so I need sometimes people who were part of the journey to say what they saw.
Yeah. I love that. It reminds me of this morning. We dropped our van off at the mechanic. I brought it to the mechanic this morning for a tune-up. And so my dad met me there and drove me back. And he's got his bicycle in the back of the van. And I'm saying, so Dad, when you put your bike in the van, like, where do you go? Where do you take it for bike rides? And I thought, maybe he'd have a favorite spot and he goes there every other day or something. He's like, oh, all over the place. Sometimes it's down by the Mississippi River, over by the U of M. Other times it's this and that. He's naming all these places he likes to bring his bike and bike. And I'm thinking, that's like me. And it was like having a mirror held up to me. I'm like, I remember when I was single, I kept in my trunk rollerblades, a pair of dance shoes, tennis racket, and swimsuit. Those 4 things I had to have with me at all times, because I never knew when I might go jump in a lake, or be driving by the ballroom studio and decide I was going to jump in on a dance class, or like call up a friend and be like, hey, want to meet me at the tennis courts, or, hop on those rollerblades and go rollerblading somewhere. And I realized, I was like, that's who I am. I'm a spontaneous adventurer, and I have to, maybe I got that from my dad. Look, he's, he never goes to the same place twice with his bike. Okay. But that's the power of community and family, to be like, this is who you are. And
absolutely,
it was like, and my dad laughed so hard when I told him I used to keep these 4 things in my trunk. And he's like, you did?
That's amazing.
Yeah. So like the beauty of community and permission to be who we are, right? Like, why does it feel so hard to give ourselves permission to, I think, I don't know, I've a lot of my life felt pressure to look like whoever it is I think I'm supposed to look like, instead of learning to be okay with who I am.
Yeah. And I think we do that physically, but I think we do that intellectually. And I think we definitely do that in the area of calling and purpose. It's like, we've got to be we're looking for the kind of woman of God trademark. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We do the right version, and we're afraid of getting it wrong. So I think it puts untold pressure on us, and it's weird.
And it's weird. And it's just weird. I love how you could just name off all these women throughout the Bible. I love that we do have, even if they're not long stories or lots of details, that we do have names and examples of women who are all doing their version of being a woman of God, right? Like Huldah, as she's got kings coming to her for advice of what to do, she's doing it her own way, which is different than how Junia is, and how, Lydia is leading her house church in the New Testament. And, they weren't all the same. I'm sure they didn't all have the same personality. They spoke different languages. They lived in different parts of the world. So, hopefully that's something that gives us permission too, that our story needs to be different. Our version of ourself needs to look unique. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's hugely important for us. And I think it's liberating, because all of those women are image bearers.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. Well, wrapping up, how about this? You recently turned 50, and
Yeah.
I read an article you wrote about just, your reflection on that. You mentioned in that article that you were reflecting on how, on legacy and how to invest in the next generation.
Yeah.
What is one piece of wisdom you've learned as you've, kind of reflected on this stage of life and what it means to steward who you are and then to pass that on and invest it into others? Like, what would be one piece of wisdom you would leave us with as a parting thought?
I would say we're always learning. We're always learning. We're not arriving, we're always learning. So keep learning, keep being expansive. And I think that can be intimidating, but it also can be exciting that we're always learning. And I think with the next generation, we just got to do it. I think we just have to invest in someone else, and whether that's a friend or a one-off piece of advice or a generous thought or a compliment, make it a habit. Make it a habit of finding ways to invest in someone. I think it's hard if you felt no one invested in you, but then I think it's a fault line for some of us because they're like, well, this is the first, and it's like, then be the first.
Yeah.
But it's a vital thing to do. I think if we wait until we're perfect, we'll never get there. And again, diminishing returns for somebody else. So I think that's been my lesson thus far, of the openness to learn and the openness to grow rather than thinking I've arrived, and the continually looking for ways to invest in other people.
I love that. My dad used to say he loved the metaphor of the Dead Sea. It receives all the nutrients from the Sea of Galilee coming through the Jordan River down to the Dead Sea, but because there's no outlet for the Dead Sea, it doesn't go anywhere. So all these rich nutrients and minerals actually, in the end of the day, end up killing anything that could live in that lake or in that sea. And so that it's a good metaphor for like the importance of giving out and also investing.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us today, Joe. We'll put in our show notes where people can go find the books you've written and resources, your podcast with Stephanie, who co-leads the EZER Collective with you. And it's just been fun to just have a nice conversation back and forth about women being image bearers, leaders, all that angle, and why going back to our story in Genesis 2 and 3 matters. So thank you for taking us there, Joe. Really appreciate this.
That's fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah. True 316 Foundation is the home of the Eden podcast. Join us for $3.16 a month or more. Let's true the verses on the key passages on women and men. Go to true316.com/partner.
I'm Dr. Joy Fleming, co-founder of the True 316 Foundation. We mention many great books on the Eden podcast. We are making them available to you for purchase on our website at true316.com/truebooks. That's true316.com/TRUBOOKS. These books are by our own True 316 authors, such as Bruce and myself, and by our guests on the Eden podcast. By purchasing these books on true316.com, the True 316 Foundation will be helped with a small commission, and the authors will benefit directly from the sales. We add titles regularly to our site, so check today and do some shopping at true316.com/TRUbooks. true316.com/truebooks.
True 316 is strengthening and encouraging many, and we're getting stories every day of lives changed through our ministry. We're the home of the Eden podcast, and we're getting the word out that God didn't curse Eve or Adam or limit woman in any way. Our volunteer help is wonderful, and we grow stronger with each new true partner who gives to the True 316 Foundation so that we can cover the costs to do the technical work of the Eden podcast, to coordinate our True School workshops like the 2-week Eden workshop on Genesis 2 and 3, and to make the True 316 Foundation function in its outreach to scholars and students around the world. You can give now with a one-time gift. And better still, you can join now and become a monthly donor. We call our monthly donors our true partners. Please join now by going to true316.com/partner.